In 1759, a wealthy Virginia widow named Martha Dandridge Custis married a rising colonial officer named George Washington. History remembers Martha Washington as America's First Lady, refined, dignified, and emblematic of early American womanhood. But history often omits a crucial truth. At the time of their marriage, George Washington owned about 18 enslaved people. Martha Washington owned 84. She brought 17,500 acres of land and a vast enslaved labor force into the marriage, making her far wealthier and more powerful than her husband. And Martha Washington was not an exception. She was part of a much larger, long-ignored reality in American history, one that challenges deeply held myths about slavery, gender, and innocence. This is the story of white women as enslavers, not as passive bystanders, but as active participants, managers, and beneficiaries of one of the most brutal systems in human history. It is a story that has been softened, minimized, and in many cases erased. Tonight we tell it plainly. For generations, American memory has preserved a comforting image of the antebellum South, the graceful plantation mistress darts silk dresses, polite smiles, sweet tea on shaded verandas. This image casts white women as the softer side of slavery, morally conflicted, powerless, or even kind. But this image is a fabrication. Enslaved people knew the truth. On plantations across the South, the mistress was not symbolic. She was authority. She approved work schedules. She ordered punishments. She decided who ate, who rested, and who was sold. Enslaved men, women, and children were required to address even teenage white girls as mistress. Power did not require masculinity. It required ownership. By the eve of the Civil War, white women made up roughly 40% of slaveholders in the American South. Nearly 2 out of every 5 enslavers were female. Census records from 1850 and 1860 list thousands of women, married, single, and widowed, as legal owners of enslaved people. Some owned large plantations, others owned 1 or 2 individuals. But ownership is ownership. When we imagine slave auctions, we must imagine women present, bidding, selling, negotiating. When we imagine plantations, we must see women not as accessories but as co-owners and managers of human property. Unlike men who often worked in fields or traveled, mistresses lived in constant proximity to the enslaved. They supervised domestic labor, they watched children, they monitored behavior minute by minute. This proximity often translated into constant violence. Formerly enslaved people recalled that mistresses inflicted slaps and punches, whippings, burns, psychological terror, family separation as punishment. The violence was often deliberate and sustained, not impulsive. One formerly enslaved man, William Wells Brown, recalled a mistress who burned a child's hands for stealing sugar and struck a housemaid so violently she broke a stick over her head. These acts were not anomalies, they were normalized. One of the most devastating aspects of slavery was sexual violence, and white women were not innocent observers. In Solomon Northup's memoir, 12 Years a Slave, we meet Patsy, an enslaved woman trapped between a sexually abusive master and a violently jealous mistress. Northup wrote that Patsy's back bore scars not because she was disobedient, but because she was the victim of a degenerate master and a jealous mistress. Mistress Mary Epps demanded Patsy be whipped repeatedly. At one point she attempted to bribe Northup to murder Patsy and dispose of her body, the crime existing. Similarly, Harriet Jacobs, in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, described how her master's wife directed her rage not at her husband, but at Jacobs herself. Jacobs wrote, "The mistress who ought to protect the helpless victim has no other feelings towards her but those of jealousy and rage." White mistresses often punished enslaved women for being raped. This was cruelty compounded by hypocrisy. Slavery was not only violence, it was business. White women bought and sold enslaved people, defended their ownership in court, used marriage contracts to retain control of human property, passed enslaved people down as inheritance. Some conducted slave transactions in their parlors over tea. One particularly cruel enterprise overseen by white women was enslaved wet nursing. Enslaved mothers were forced to breastfeed white infants, often while their own babies were neglected or taken away. Some mistresses orchestrated pregnancies among enslaved women to ensure future wet nurses. Black motherhood became a commodity. This was not ignorance, it was calculation. When abolition threatened slavery, white women became some of its fiercest defenders. They wrote propaganda. They organized pro-slavery societies. They encouraged men to fight for the Confederacy. When enslaved people fled to Union lines, mistresses often responded with violence. One Mississippi woman, Martha Gibbs, forced enslaved people on a 400-mile march into Texas, pistol in hand, to avoid emancipation. Even after the war ended, she kept them captive until Union officials intervened. Freedom was resisted to the bitter end. After emancipation, white women helped preserve racial dominance through sharecropping exploitation, false criminal accusations, convict leasing, historical revisionism. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy rewrote textbooks, erected monuments, and erased women's brutality from public memory. Popular culture followed. Gone with the Wind replaced whips and chains with nostalgia. The gentle mistress was reborn, sanitized, absolved. This history is uncomfortable. It challenges myths about innocence, gender, and morality. But truth does not exist to comfort us. White women in slaveholding America were not powerless victims of the system. They were investors, enforcers, and beneficiaries. They inflicted suffering. They defended cruelty. They rewrote history to excuse themselves. And the people they enslaved paid the price, then and for generations afterward. Remembering this does not diminish women's struggles. It completes the historical record. And without honesty, there can be no justice and no healing. Thank you for staying with us. If this story mattered to you, please like, share, and subscribe. Here we bring truth back from the shadows where it was left.